Hello, hello, Matt Reads Books. It's me, Matt, reading books. We're still going through Theory of Justice by John Rawls, and as ever, we're going to do 30 minutes, and as we're following that new format, I'm just going to pop in and pop out as pleases me. Let's adjust this a little bit. So, without further ado, Section 17, the tendency to equality. Rawls wants to conclude his discussion of the two principles of justice by explaining how they express an egalitarian concept of justice as opposed to other sorts of concepts, and reply to the possible objection that his principle of fair opportunity leads to meritocracy. So first, Rawls wants to say that the principle of the difference principle gives some weight to a principle of redress, where undeserved inequalities, for example, of having fewer native assets or a less favorable social position, call for the social structure to redress those contingencies. But Rawls wants to make sure that we know that the principle of redress is not identical to the difference principle. The goal isn't just to level the playing field entirely. There's more flexibility. If it advances the position of the least well off, that the more intelligent, for example, are given more resources in education, as long as it advantages the less intelligent, then that is permissible according to the difference principle. The goal of the whole project is not to be calculated in terms of economic efficiency or social welfare. Instead, Rawls says an equal value, an equal rubric for evaluating the success of the policy to economic efficiency and social welfare, though those should be valued, is enabling a person to enjoy the culture of his society and to take part in its affairs. And in these ways, to provide, and this is really the master value, to provide each individual a secure sense of his own worth. But even though the difference principle is different from the principle of redress, it still achieves some of the goals of the principle of redress in not arranging the basic structure according to social efficiency or technocratic value. Rawls says the difference principle represents, quote, an agreement to regard the distribution of natural talents as in some respects a common asset. And thereby, everyone may gain from their good fortune only on terms that improve the situation of those who've lost out. So we're not ignoring the fact that there's inequalities. We're merely saying that you can only you can only actualize your natural advantages if that benefits those who are less well off. Now, Rawls doesn't want to say that the simple fact that there are differences of talents means that there is injustice in nature. He says these are just natural facts. What is just and unjust is the way that institutions deal with the facts of differences in nature. And he says that what makes aristocratic and caste societies unjust is that they make these contingent inequalities the ascriptive basis for belonging to privileged social classes. The basic structure of these societies incorporates the arbitrariness found in nature, but you don't have to do that. The social system is changeable and under human control. So justice as fairness says we only take advantage of our advantages, our natural advantages, when it's for the common benefit. And when we order institutions to deal with natural facts in this way, we can say that those institutions are just. The question arises, doesn't it seem like we're unjustly biased towards the least well off? Rawls uses a thought experiment to get rid of this intuition. He says, imagine there's only two classes in society, the well-off and the less well-off, as there must be. If you, let's take off the table advantaging advantaging the most well-off, right? Uh, to advance the well-off simply because they're well-off seems pretty patently contrary to intuition. But Rawls says, well, okay, then if you don't favor the difference principle, where we advantage the least well-off, then you have to take some sort of weighted average of the two. But whenever we give any weight to the people who are more fortunate, we are premising, we're valuing in our judgment the arbitrary action of these people being better off, and that also just seems just as unjust as simply valuing them for being better off in the original case. And so in that way, we have to rethink about it. Then how is it that those advantaged people can reasonably view their position under the difference principle? Why wouldn't they reject it? Um, and the Rawls's thought is, well, they recognized that they have already been compensated by nature. Uh, they've already received a gift from nature by the advantages that they didn't have a prior claim to. And so they forego any state intervention because they've already received an intervention on their behalf. And all the state intervention does is change what that gift of nature effects on net once you factor in the basic structure. I think with the libertarian that people just innately deserve whatever they can get, whatever their greater advantages, under a scheme of cooperation. And Rawls's point is, yeah, under a scheme of cooperation, where cooperation is qualified by justice, which is contextualized by social structures, which means this question is irrelevant to the question of justifying what the just social structures that condition cooperation must look like. And so, Rawls concludes in clarifying the egalitarian nature of the difference principle by saying that we don't deserve our place in society, and we don't deserve our natural talents, and we don't even deserve our superior virtue, our better moral character, since those things are so conditioned by contingencies in a sort of ultimate overriding sense. But we do have a right to these natural assets uh, in a more limited sense, in the sense that they're covered by the first principle, and so within a system of fair social cooperation, we're entitled to the fruits of these things. But since the question at hand is what is the system of fair social cooperation, we can't confuse these two things. There are things that the first principle of basic liberty secures and gives as sort of like the basic direction and energy of these powers. But then the difference principle says, well, but we exercise these in a society, so how are these partial rights completed in the context of a system of social cooperation? Rawls noted earlier in section 13 that the society should only try to permit the advantage of the better off as long as it also advantaged the less well off. And so the ideal is something like a perfect harmony of the two, where there's a perfect 45-degree angle if you have the well-off and the less well-off on two different axes. But of course, in fact, there is some kind of curve where, um, as the well-off are given an extra advantage, the less well-off receive an advantage, but then at some point they no longer receive an advantage. Um, and it seems just a consequence of the difference principle that you should try to make this as close to that 45-degree line as possible. But Rawls's point here is that ultimately the original shape of the curve is going to be determined by natural talents. To what degree a marginal improvement in the assets of the well-off improves the lot of the less well-off depends entirely upon who composes those classes. Um, and so the basic structure is only able to do so much to move curves from the starting place in the natural position. But you could imagine that over time it would be able to effect greater and greater conformity to the 45-degree ideal. Rawls also wants to say that an advantage of the difference principle is that it gives a particular articulation of the principle of fraternity. The principle of fraternity being sort of vague and maybe not even entirely political in many conceptions, but it has something to do with equality of social esteem or the absence of uh, aristocratic deference or deference to aristocrats. Um, and Rawls says, well, the difference principle is sort of an economic outwork of this, where you don't want to have greater advantages unless it's to the benefit of those who are less well off. And he gives the example of the family as a case where something like this is already operative, where family members don't want to find their own station improved unless it improves the lot of fellow family members. Now, the more common interpretation of fraternity, or at least what comes to mind, is a sort of uh, sentimental idea that therefore should be neglected in democratic theory. But Rawls says, well, but when we interpret it as uh, corresponding to the difference principle, it's not as impracticable a conception. In fact, it's a perfectly reasonable standard. And we can even begin to associate Rawls's scheme of two principles with the traditional ideas from the French Revolution of liberty, equality, and fraternity, where liberty corresponds to the first principle, the liberty principle. Equality corresponds to the equality of the first principle, which is equality of citizenship, and the equality of fair opportunity. And fraternity corresponds to the difference principle. Now, of course, there's more to fraternity than this, but Rawls argues that sort of the core aspect from the standpoint of social justice for fraternity is something like the difference principle. Point, Rawls thinks it's pretty clear that his conception is not going to be confused with the meritocratic conception, um, but rather the principles of justice, especially in the difference principle, uh, requires some fundamental alteration of society, especially once we take into account that self-respect counts as one of the primary goods to be subjected to the difference principle. Um, and he says he's going to elaborate on this more in section 79 when he discusses the well-ordered society as a social union of social unions. But he says that if a confident sense of self-worth for the least well-off is critical and a goal of the difference principle, then any form of hierarchy or inequality is going to come under scrutiny, and ultimately be very limited. Um, and the effort that goes towards enriching the personal and social life of the lower class of citizens will, as society progresses, become more and more center stage. Concludes this section by returning to the question of whether the social structure affects the natural order. He says originally he was saying, well, it doesn't. What matters is the social structure's position, because that is what is just or unjust, not nature. But he does say that, well, nature and the social structure are going to interact ultimately. And he briefly mentions that he is not going to consider the question of eugenics. Um, Although he will nevertheless note here that it is to the advantage of the less fortunate in general um, to increase the talents of others, and it might be something owed to the next generation uh, that the next generation has the best genetic endowment that is possible. And that if there is some sort of upper bound, he hopes for a future where everyone enjoys this sort of greatest equal liberty and greatest equal talent. But this is really not the project at hand. So this is just the note that he's going to make on that. And that brings us to the end of Matt Reed's books. Once again, I'd love to thank you for listening. Of course, smash that like and subscribe and bell icons. And just as a preview for next week, we're going to go through this fun chart. Woohoo! So, get ready for that, and I'll see you next time.